two C-shaped lateral ventricles, and they are the largest ones, and they are located within the cerebral hemispheres. Now, between and below these two lateral ventricles, okay, I forgot to mention, this is one lateral ventricle and this is the another lateral ventricle shown in that image. Now, between these two lateral ventricles and below these lateral ventricles, you can see another ventricle, and that is called the third ventricle. Okay, third ventricle is a single ventricle, and that is present in the diencephalon. Okay, diencephalon is another part of the brain. The diencephalon part of the brain is relatively hidden. You can't see the diencephalon very clearly when you examine the brain from the outside. Okay, that is between, and the name diencephalon means between brain. So, it is located a little bit hidden within the core of the brain. So, within the diencephalon, you have the third ventricle. Now, the third ventricle then communicates into the fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle is what you are seeing here. In this lateral projection view, you can see that fourth ventricle is appearing something like a tent shaped called AnaVu. Okay, now you are seeing this tool. This tool is called AnaVu. This tool has a 3D interface. What you are seeing here is the 3D interface, and on this side, that means on the right side of the screen, you are seeing three panels. Okay, these three panels are the canonical views that you see in radiology. Okay, for example, this one that you see is an axial section or the horizontal section. This one that you see is a coronal section, that is a plane that goes like this. Okay, that will divide the brain or the head and neck into an anterior and a posterior parts, and this is a sagittal section that goes like this, that will divide the brain into left and right parts. And the flexibility of this tool is that you can rotate this 3D viewport into any view that you want. Okay, for example, you are now seeing the ventricular system anatomy, and you can view it from any part that you want to understand the anatomy in much detail. And you can move these planes into any plane that you want to see how these structures will be appearing in a sectional view. For example, in a coronal image, you can see how the ventricular system is located in this image, or in a sagittal image, you can zoom in and you can see how the ventricular system will be looking in a sagittal image. So, this is the capability, the flexibility of this tool, and with this we will have a look at the ventricular anatomy in this view. Okay, in the sagittal view, I am moving this plane to make it a little more clear. Okay, you can see the two lateral ventricles. Okay, can you see the two lateral ventricles? What you see as blue are the two lateral ventricles. You can see that is a very enormous, it is C-shaped lateral ventricles. It has different projections. This is the anterior horn, the inferior horn, the posterior horn. I will come to that details in a lateral ventricle session. But eventually you can see that the lateral ventricles are located within the cerebral hemispheres. You can see that very clearly here, right? This is the coronal section, and you can see that coronal section view you can see here, and you can understand that this is the CSF filled ventricular cavity, the lateral ventricle cavity, and you can see that in this coronal image. And you can move this to a front plane, and you can see how this lateral ventricle is appearing in this coronal section. You can see this dark colored cavity that you see here is that they are the lateral ventricles. You can see how close two lateral ventricles are. So, all of this is visible when you can move these planes to front and back. Okay, now I am moving this in the side view for you to understand how the C-shaped cavities are communicating to the midline third ventricle. You can see the midline third ventricle that was located within the diencephalon. So, that midline third ventricle is communicating with the two lateral ventricles through these two small channels, through these two small canals, and they are called as the foramen of Monro. So, the foramen of Monro is communicating the lateral ventricle into the third ventricle. The third ventricle is a single cavity in the midline, and the lateral ventricles are two enormous cavities in the cerebral hemispheres. And you can see the third ventricle is having different pockets. We will come to that details in the when we learn about the third ventricle in detail later. And you can see a large hole inside this third ventricle. Is it seen? It looks like a big perforation inside that. Okay, that we will come to that details later when we learn about the third ventricle. But here you can see that if I move the axial plane more downwards and the coronal plane more backwards, you can see how the the ventricular system, the fourth ventricular system is there. Okay, this is the fourth ventricle cavity, and the fourth ventricle cavity is located behind the pons and the medulla and in front of the cerebellum. What you are seeing here is the cerebellum. Okay, this section that you see here, that is a cerebellum. In front of that you are seeing the pons and the medulla. I will just move the sagittal plane into this fourth ventricle to make that very clear. Now you can see how clearly you can see the pons in front and the medulla below, and the cerebellum is located behind, and between that you are seeing the fourth ventricle. Okay, now you can see this long tube. That long tube is nothing but the aqueduct of Sylvius. The aqueduct of Sylvius is actually passing through this structure, and that structure is called the midbrain. Midbrain, pons and the medulla is together forming the brain stem. Okay, and behind the pons and medulla you are having the fourth ventricle, and through the midbrain you are seeing the aqueduct of Sylvius, that is communicating the third ventricle, which is in the diencephalon, to the fourth ventricle, which is in the hindbrain. The hindbrain is the pons plus medulla plus the cerebellum. Okay, so altogether I gave an overview about the ventricular system through different perspectives, not only in the 3D perspective, in the sectional view, in the diagram, but also in scans, how you can identify these